Hello everyone and welcome to HIV Scotland Live, our Q&A with the wonderful Patrick Strudwick and James Bushe. Sorry about the slight delay, but I did get kicked off. It's the first technical problem we've had in this current series, so we've been lucky in that respect. We're delighted to be joined by James Bushe. Some of you will know him as Pilot Anthony, and the wonderful journalist Patrick Strudwick. The topic of this conversation is taking on the system and winning, and we're going to deep dive into the campaign that James led with both HIV Scotland and Patrick's help to change aviation law to ensure that people living with HIV could train as pilots. We're going to have a conversation. If you've got any questions that you want to submit, then do submit them on one of the platforms that you're watching on. We've got Facebook, YouTube, Twitter or Twitch for the technologically adept of you. So I'm going to introduce James and Patrick here. So here we go, and adding them to the stream. Hello, James, and hello, Patrick.
Hello, hi.
How are you both?
Hello, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you, Nathan.
Good. Now, I've got a first comment up already from someone who has said, James, you're too adorable, and the journalist Patrick as well. So that's a nice little start there for you both. I hope you that's going to kick off our conversation. But I wanted first to just get you both to introduce yourself and perhaps tell everyone that's watching a bit about you and what brought you to be on this Q&A this evening. And maybe we'll start with you, James.
Sure. So hello, everybody. My name is James Bushe. I am currently a commercial pilot flying with Logan Air up in Scotland. I wanted to be a pilot from a very early age, and unfortunately, when I was diagnosed with HIV, subsequently found out that my diagnosis at the time was going to prevent me from becoming a pilot. And I subsequently campaigned with Nathan and Patrick's help to change the regulations to allow me and others to train and become commercial airline pilots.
Over to you, Patrick.
My turn. I'm Patrick Strudwick. I'm the LGBT editor of Buzzfeed, and I've been writing about HIV for many years, nearly 2 decades, in fact. And when I first spoke to James after being introduced through HIV Scotland, it was very clear to me that this is a really important story with really wide implications, not just for the aviation industry, but also for HIV equal rights, for human rights, for non-discrimination. So I also could see that there was a very clear potential win here if we fought hard enough. So we fought from that moment on, really.
So I'm having some problems with my mouse. So James, what you know, when you came to HIV Scotland, you'd done months worth of research. So what was the first moment where you thought about taking on the system? Like, what? Obviously, you found out that you couldn't become a pilot. You'd been rejected on the basis of your HIV status. At what moment and what thought did you think about taking on the system?
I think it was for me when I'd sort of exhausted the internal process within the Civil Aviation Authority here in the UK, and then subsequently with the EASA, the European regulator. And, you know, it sort of left me with a feeling of, I understand their position from a safety perspective, in that, you know, and I always make this point every time I speak about it, is that, you know, aviation is a safety critical industry, and we always have to come from the standpoint of, you know, we need to prove that something is safe or someone is safe before they'll let them fly an aeroplane. The bit for me that didn't make sense with regards to HIV was that the evidence that we were using to to make the case for flight safety, or as it was back then, was quite out of date. And not only that, it was a position whereby people who were already pilots who subsequently became HIV positive could continue to fly, whereas people like myself who were HIV positive but didn't yet have a license couldn't. And that sort of, discrimination between two groups of people living with this condition just didn't seem right. And once I'd exhausted that internal process, I knew that I needed help, and that's when I came to HIV Scotland.
And Patrick, I remember when I phoned you and said, "Oh, I think I've got something here." Did you ever imagine, after having that conversation, that you were on to a winner of a story that would lead to the change that's happened, and for it to happen so quickly?
I'm trying to remember my thought process at the time. To be honest, I did. I didn't think it would happen so quickly, but what was very clear was that a terrible mistake had been made. And that mistake was both in the interpretation of the law, the interpretation of the European guidelines, but in particular, the mistake in the interpretation of the science. It was so outdated. The idea that someone with HIV today who's on treatment could be a risk to passengers in a plane was just preposterous. Factoring that against also the provisions within the Equality Act, in which people with HIV are covered by disability protections, meant that I knew at least that there would be a uproar about what is a clear sense of discrimination. One of the things that I often have done at BuzzFeed is, as the only LGBT specific member of staff, I will often kind of talk about stories in the office first to get people's reaction as kind of, random straight people. And some gays. And, when I mentioned this, everyone was just like, what? Who says you can't fly a plane because you've got HIV? That's ridiculous. And when you get that sort of reaction, you know that that's what the public reaction is going to be. So I think pretty quickly it was clear that what we had here was the ultimate path to success, because you had very high chance of public outrage. You had the law on your side. You had science, medicine on your side. And very quickly, we had politicians on board, like Nicola Sturgeon. So altogether, that with two regulatory bodies with their eye off the ball, not having caught up to speed on any of those things, there was an open goal. I'm never wildly optimistic, because even when it's clearly wrong, organizations will often dig their heels in. So I wasn't wildly optimistic, I don't think, but I also knew, all things being right, this will shift. We actually have an opportunity here. And you have one individual taking the fight to the regulator.
It did seem at the time like it was a perfect mix of, often some of these bigger policy changes don't happen with real life people wanting there to be a change. So it was the perfect mix, because James was there as a person who wanted to change the pilot, not just someone who, one day woke up and thought, "Oh, that would be nice." Like this was your lifetime ambition, James, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I've said this a lot. I started flying before I could drive, and it was always for me, the dream was to become a commercial pilot. And as soon as I sort of had the opportunity to do that, I wanted to. And I remember thinking, taking it back to when I was first diagnosed with HIV, thinking, actually, do you know what? If any other hurdle I can overcome, and any sort of internal resolution that I needed to have about that diagnosis, I made pretty quickly. And the only part that I just couldn't get past was this. And I thought, you know what, we can't let anyone's status impact their career choice or any ambition that they have. And you know, it was that, and that's why it was so important to sort of give that belief to anyone who finds themselves in that situation, that you know, if you face discrimination because your status, challenge it.
Patrick, you mentioned digging the fact that some organisations could dig their heels in, and I think we'd maybe all speak of seeing that happen very early on in the campaign, which was that the CAA either dug their heels in and were adamant that they weren't wrong, or they just flat out refused to respond to people. And I think there was many times where we'd have some phone calls where the CAA would have refused to speak to me or HMV Scotland, but you might have got something from them, Patrick. And actually, it was that person's intervention that you mentioned as well, Patrick, when the First Minister of Scotland stood up in the Parliament and said that it wasn't right. James, do you want to explain the political engagement and how we got to the point of the First Minister speaking in the Scottish Parliament about the campaign?
Yeah, sure. So there was two routes really. First of all, we took it to Bob Doris, who's still my MSP here in Glasgow, and you know, he could see, you know, to Patrick's point about just the put that scenario to somebody to gauge a reaction, and you know, he was immediately supportive to say, well, this, you know, this doesn't make any sense, and it's blatant discrimination. We put that same question to Patrick Grady, MP in Westminster, and both Bob and Patrick took a question to the respective parliaments. So Patrick took the question to transport questions down in Westminster to say, you know, my constituent is HIV positive. Do we believe that this should prevent them from becoming an airline pilot? And in the same way, Bob Doris took the question to First Minister's questions, and you know, Nicola Sturgeon agreed that actually the position was discriminatory and it needed to be challenged. And at First Minister's questions, at First Minister's questions, Nicola Sturgeon agreed to write to the CAA on our behalf to object to their current position. And in Westminster, what I didn't realise at the time actually was the amount of background work that question had. So on the back of Patrick's question in Westminster and transport questions, the issue was raised at the Transport Select Committee, and I believe, you know, caused quite a lively debate, which ultimately led to their endorsement as well. And you know, that political support was crucial, really. And yeah, I don't think that without that, we certainly wouldn't have been able to have made the change as quickly as we did.
Yeah, there was quite a lot of political engagement. That Transport Select Committee, I think, had already been doing some work in aviation, and I'd tried to crowbar in this into their inquiry into the Civil Aviation Authority, which I think might have helped, you know, because sometimes the political system can be quite the difficult nut to crack. When I think back to the campaign, you know, I think it really was a 3-month period where it was the only thing I was thinking about, because I was, like Patrick said, was so confident of us actually doing something and changing the law for the better because of where we were at. There was many different paths I thought we could go down as well. You know, we I think talked about getting ready to sue the government or the Civil Aviation Authority. And was there anything, Patrick, that you were getting ready to do as a journalist to try and help the campaign that maybe you didn't have to use a technique or a specific line of inquiry?
I think I was aware that there were different paths that could be walked down, and it would take a while to work out which ones. Actually, what happened was a triangulation where the Civil Aviation Authority began to see that there was nowhere to turn, because once you have both politicians on your side and the law on your side and the public going, what on earth is this? You don't really have, your options are running out. From my end, I had quite a lot of kind of back end conversations with both EASA, the European aviation regulator, and with the CAA, so, both on the phone and via email. Some of those conversations were fairly heated. It was much of which felt like the typical scenario you get with big organizations that move very slowly. Oh, well, we haven't commissioned this piece of research to ascertain whether the original scientific evidence that it was based on is in fact flawed. We haven't done this, we haven't done that. And I'm on the phone to the CAA saying, well, you can spend all the time you like, but the longer you take, the more likely you are to come up against a lawsuit. And that lawsuit will be invoking the Equality Act against you. So, there were several conversations like that, where it was almost like they were sort of in denial about the legal situation and how far outside of it they fell, that they needed jolting and going, oh yeah, no, really, we are actually discriminating against people unlawfully, and we need to rectify this quickly. Part of the lag was also, obviously, they were still thinking about safety, which of course is necessary and is the fundamental of all flying, safety first. But they wanted to do every single possible check and balance before feeling confident enough to make that change. And I think this story is not this story is not a narrow one. It speaks to so many issues about equality and discrimination, but also about how organizations work and how they operate. And very often, organizations' first priority is to themselves, is to protect themselves. And sometimes you need to shake them into realizing that staying as they are is a greater threat to themselves than changing. People resist change.
Yeah. And James, one of the things that came out of the campaign and the subsequent work that's happened was almost a feeling that were the CAA being purposefully discriminatory, or was it just them being slow to respond? And now, actually, are the CAA the ones that are taking it to the wider system? And actually, should they be is there an extent to which the CAA should be commended for the work that they are doing now? They might have been slow to respond initially, but now they're the ones that are taking this up with Europe and with the wider aviation industry. Did we give the CAA a bad name, rightly or wrongly, during the campaign?
Do you know what? I think what we did in the campaign at every stage of the campaign was state the facts and state the position of where the relevant organizations were at the time, and the campaign in itself was there to help shift those positions. Where we are now is, and I think not totally 100% attributable to the campaign, but certainly as a direct, as in part as a result of it, is the CAA is the only organization within Europe, and the first organization within Europe, to allow HIV positive people to train as pilots. And as a direct result of the campaign, EASA, the European regulator, have commissioned a study to change the rules at their level. So, there's two parts to me. There's one part that says, at the time, did those rules, did those regulations prevent me from becoming? Yes. Were the CAA the gatekeeper of those rules? Yes. But as a result of the campaign, it's promoted conversation, not just within the CIA, but within EASA as well, to say, actually, we need to change these rules, and not just even about HIV. And I think this is the Patrick alluded to it earlier, but the bigger issue here is how organizations and regulators in particular engage with and treat and relate to the individual. Outside of this context, I've been involved with the European Aviation Wellbeing Committee, whose role is to challenge in other areas, in similar areas, with the regulators, to say, hey, this is the impact that these regulations can have on an individual if they're not fit for purpose, based on the scientific, social, political agenda. Is that a really long-winded answer to the were they right or were they wrong?
I think it's a good answer anyway. What I was going to come on to was, fast forward a year after the campaign, was successful, and you, James, qualified as a pilot, or might have been slightly longer than a year, but we followed your journey, training as a pilot. Then you took a decision to come out publicly, because during the campaign you were Pilot Anthony. People might remember your hands and your watch from the BBC piece that I think your mum had bought you the watch. She didn't recognise the watch on TV. You then took that decision to come out publicly. What do you think that did beyond the initial campaign, in terms of your reasons for deciding to come out publicly and almost become, and one of the questions that I'm going to come to in a second that was submitted, almost become a minor celebrity in the HIV movement?
That's a funny one. So I guess I can say what I hoped it would achieve, and I guess the starting point for me was that I campaigned under this pseudonym of Pilot Anthony, which we've never said this before. Pilot Anthony was the name that was chosen by Patrick for me. So Patrick.
Yeah, sorry, I randomly chose your name like a bad mother just pulling it out of a hat.
Yeah. To be fair, I've been called far worse. So yeah, when I was doing all this as Pilot Anthony, on the one hand, brilliant, because in the back of my mind I was thinking, wow, it's amazing how much we've achieved and nobody knows it's me. But on the other hand, the biggest one who was living with HIV, including myself, in that journey is stigma. And in continuing to campaign as Pilot Anthony, I got to a stage where I thought, all I'm doing here is perpetuating that stigma, because I'm saying, hey, if you want to change something, but you're HIV positive, don't show your face, don't tell everyone who you are. And that started to impact and make me feel sort of ashamed of my own status. And I thought, no, this needs to change. So, I wanted to come out as me, to in a personal sense, complete that journey as me, and to say to anybody else that is living with HIV and facing that same or a similar situation, it's okay to be yourself. If you need to campaign to change something, then if you need to do anything, then HIV should be no barrier to that, and it certainly shouldn't be anything that you should be ashamed of. And then even wider than that, and I think this was a little bit of the added benefit at the time, and every time we start having a conversation about HIV in general in society, it gets the message out there of you equals you, because all three of us come across new people where we have come there. We say, oh, by the way, do you realize that I'm HIV positive? I can live exactly the same long, happy, healthy life as you, and I can't pass the virus on. And undetectable equals untransmittable. And that was, I recognized that we had a platform. I recognized on the basis of how much traction the story had got, even when I was anonymous, that if we did this and people could actually see that there was a real person behind this campaign, that we had an opportunity to hopefully change some perceptions with regards to people that live with HIV.
And many journalists and camera people got you in your uniform to parade around in order to be that face.
It's a different conversation, but I think I was joking with some colleagues earlier this week to say it's become more of a costume this year than it has a uniform. It's in a good way, in all ways, for sure.
Patrick, what advice would you give someone who might have a similar issue, regardless of whether it was related to HIV, who rightly thought that they were being discriminated against and wanted to take on the system? What advice would you give them in order to do that and hopefully come to the same conclusion that we have in this campaign?
I mean, I think this is quite a useful template in recognizing what levers you can pull and which levers will be effective. We pulled all of them. So anyone who's being discriminated against, let's say for any reason under the Equality Act, your options are, first of all, find a journalist who you think is trustworthy, whose work you like and know, ideally someone who might be personally recommended to you. That's one option. Another option is to get some free advice, maybe from the Citizens Advice Bureau, some free legal advice. Go to a relevant charity, as James did with HIV Scotland. Also, go and see your local MP. Yes, write to them, but go to their surgery and say to them, you need to take up this case. I'm your constituent. This is a breach of the Equality Act. You can champion this cause, and your success in overturning it will reflect well on you. You can make capital out of this. Of course, most MPs are in it for the common good, and all MPs want to change things for the better. There's, and some MPs also want to bask in the glory of that. But, they are a very useful tool. They can ask questions in Parliament. They can write to, select committees. They can write to secretaries of state. They can do a lot. I think overall, be strategic, be careful in who you go to, but ultimately just speak out. If you need to and feel most comfortable to, do that on social media. But I think you have to sort of ask yourself, how much of myself do I want in the public domain right now and in the future? Because when you take up a cause, the spotlight does fall on you, as James has found when he unmasked himself, and you have to be comfortable with that. So, take some baby steps, have a private conversation first, get some good advice, work out where you are legally, make sure that you're absolutely sure that you're in the right, and then start getting some support, get charity support, get media support, get legal support, get political support. And if you can get all that, you're very likely onto a winner.
I would agree. So, James, we had a question come in.
Just to...
No, on you go.
Yeah, just to add to that, and it's something that I didn't pick up on when I explained it earlier, but before this campaign started, I felt, and no one's asked me to shout this one out, but it's important to me to say it. I felt quite detached from politics and from my local MPs and you know, my MSP, and I would never have really imagined, you know, how powerful that could be to engage with them. And you know, we did that, and I remember, Nathan, that Patrick and Bob sat in Patrick's office to have that initial conversation, and it was just completely mind blowing to me to think that, you know, less than a week later, Nicola Sturgeon was talking about the issue. So, you know, to anyone that might feel, actually, nah, there's no way that I could possibly engage with a local politician and it to make it to that forum, it can and it does. And you know, and also to anybody who feels that, you know, that any sort of skepticism about taking an issue of that level of sensitivity to the media, which, you know, prior to Patrick and I having a conversation, our initial conversation about it, I was, oh, is this, you know, is this giving all of me to somebody and then trusting them only to pick those parts out that you hope you're both on the same page and feel that are relevant and important, was really scary. But if you have picked the right person, and you know, there is a circle of trust within a group of people, then yeah, it can be, and it was proven to be, an incredibly powerful tool in both forums. So yeah, I just wanted to
I
add
think
that sort of 2 pence from my side, if you get it.
I think that's really important, James. And you know what Patrick said as well, which was using a charity, so like HIV Scotland, who became the link between you, James, and Patrick. And we thought about Patrick because we knew we could trust him as a journalist who could get
Yes.
to the meat of an issue, and that then in itself supported you, because it wasn't just someone that you'd found on Twitter that you didn't know if you could trust. It was, you know, that there was an organisational relationship with this journalist, a personal one between me and Patrick.
Absolutely. Yeah, there was nothing speculative about it. It was, you know, it was an organisation that I trusted, and that was like HIV Scotland, and it was you going to somebody that you trusted to say, you know, this is where we are. Can you help us?
Perfect mix. I wanted to just skip to a question that we had submitted, which I remember during the initial months of the campaign, never expecting to have become an expert in aviation policy or all of the different bits of aviation policy that we had to get to the nitty gritty of. But I think this question's come from a pilot. They've said they've read articles about you, James, and thank you for the work that you've done, that different medications could provide a more flexible regulatory approach and allow the need for an OML restriction, which is a multi-crew limitation, to be determined on a case-by-case basis, largely dependent on the stage of HIV. They've said that in future this could allow prospective pilots having HIV to obtain a license without that restriction. They've said that they believe that you're now currently flying or not flying at the moment, but usually flying with the restriction in your medical. Is that something that you or the CA might be working on to have removed, so that people living with HIV don't have to have that restriction? And they ask because due to coronavirus, they've lost their job and they're afraid of being discriminated against when they apply for new roles because they have that restriction on their medical certificate.
Okay, so the short answer is yes. The work that was commissioned at a European level on the back of this campaign was to gather the medical evidence and put a means of compliance, as it's known, together that would allow people on certain medications to have that limitation removed. And that's certainly something that I've committed to following up through this entire process. Last year, the barrier was Brexit, which was obviously taking up a hell of a lot of everyone's time. This year, it's obvious what the barrier is. But yes, it's something that I'm committed to making sure happens, because the bit for me that is the next stage is that, for example, if I wanted to be a helicopter pilot, I couldn't, because that involves me flying on my own. And any other role, and there are many roles in aviation. Aviation is much wider than just the big jet jobs, if you like. So there are still parts of that industry that, as the rules stand, because of this multi-crew limitation, that somebody who is HIV positive couldn't go into, and that's why the job isn't done. And EASA are working on it, and I will certainly be picking up the phone to Patrick if that doesn't move in a sort of sensible timeline in the context of everything that's going on in the world just now.
Is there, beyond that restriction being lifted, is there anything more that we have to do in aviation to make it a discrimination-free zone for people living with HIV?
It's a great question. For pilots, obviously, the UK CAA are leading the charge with regards to HIV just now, and in this case, it's going to shape European regulation. So actually, the answer to the earlier question is, where are we now? Actually, yeah, we've been pretty proud of being the people to have made that happen and have a regulator that is on board with our way of thinking now. But there are other parts of the world where that isn't the case. And I encourage anyone who's in the same position to really dig into the detail of those regulations. But bigger than that, there is still an issue with regards to people living with HIV and travel. There are 9-10 countries in the world whereby a HIV positive person will be deported even if to enter the country and their status was discovered or have been declared. You being a prime example, and if we want to take that back to aviation, we all know how big the Middle East is as an aviation hub. So that has a disproportionate impact. And in the context of the current scenario we face with coronavirus, you can understand exactly why travel restrictions have to be in place. And if you look back 20 years, 30 years, you could understand why those travel restrictions might have had to have been in place with HIV, because it was a virus that we knew a lot less about, and we couldn't treat nor control the transmission. There's parallels there. Today, what we are essentially saying with regards to travel is that we, in certain parts of the world, in certain countries, are still applying the same rationale to HIV as is currently being applied to situations of COVID-19. So that, for me, is a whole other arena that I think it's really important to tackle at a later date.
Patrick, what do you think about that? Because obviously, there are many cases where law changes in one country have led to changes in others. Do you think there's some countries that currently have these travel restrictions for people living with HIV? Is it, again, a case of them just being slow to respond, or are there more fundamental changes that are needed in some countries in order for us to get to a place where everywhere in the world is kept up with the times, that HIV is not what it once was?
And I think it does vary country to country, and the underlying issues are sometimes complicated. So, for example, some of those countries have, quite repressive regimes, period. Some of them restrict women's fertility rights and access to abortion, and access to contraceptive pill. So there's that hurdle. Also, some countries who are lower income countries don't have very high levels of access to treatment. And so, we in the West, it's very easy for us to say, oh, HIV today is completely different to AIDS in the 80s, except that in most countries in the world, people still die of HIV-related causes from advanced HIV because they don't get tested and treated in time, or because they just never get treatment. So, there's many different parts of this jigsaw puzzle. And, the whole issue of criminalization of HIV doesn't operate in and of itself. It operates within a wider picture of sexual health, women's rights, LGBT rights, non-discrimination as human rights as fundamentals. And there is a sort of correlation between countries that have good human rights records and don't have restrictions on HIV travelers with HIV. I mean, the United States is an interesting case in this. Because they were very slow to begin lifting restrictions on tourists entering the country. For years, people with HIV went to America anyway and just lied. They were forced to conceal the truth because they had this stupid law that was a hangover from the 80s, which, and it took Obama to overturn that eventually. I mean, that's only in the last few years, which is extraordinary, really. And it's also the case that there are parts of America where, because they have no universal health care and because they have enormous levels of inequality and impoverishment, there are some parts of America where the proportion of people with HIV who are on treatment is less than 30%. So
we're hearing last week from Bruce Richland, who leads the Prevention Access campaign based out of New York, that in one of the richest countries in the world, in general, so overall, 50% of people living with HIV can't access treatment.
Yeah,
which is quite.
And so when you push against any part of this, and James is so right to invoke the global picture here. It's great that we've had this win in the UK. It's great that has a good chance of being spread across Europe. But there's so much more to do, particularly in across other continents. There's no continent that's free of HIV discrimination, and very few places have the 90-90-90 threshold all sorted as we do in the UK. I think the other thing that has changed, though, while stigma remains a massive problem for HIV, one thing that has changed is, I think, a lot to do with the success of LGBT rights and, in particular, same-sex marriage. I think those things have really brought to the table just the idea of equality and not discriminating against people. So, if you speak to people under a certain age, under the age of sort of 35, because they kind of became adults in a climate in which people could expect to be treated fairly and equally, particularly in certain countries, there's a greater level of indignation when they hear that someone's been mistreated or discriminated against. So, whether it's the people in my office when I tell them about James going, what? How is that a thing? To, people who see a report on the BBC about James winning. There's just that there's a different expectation now that actually no, people shouldn't be discriminated against. You know, in the end, ideas are the most powerful of all, and the more any of us can make an idea go round the world, the greater the chance there is of other people pushing that too. It's the same with courage. You know, courage calls to courage everywhere. So James's courage led to politicians being courageous and standing up for him, and led to the change which will further inspire people, other people with HIV and other people who are experiencing discrimination, to step up, to step forward, in the knowledge that they too can take on huge organizations and can win.
James, do you have anything to add to that?
I think it's a perfect summation, really, and that you know, it goes back to me saying why I ultimately in the end wanted to come out, and that was to give people the confidence, and to Patrick's words, the courage to do the same thing. And you know, the job isn't done, and it's funny actually, sometimes I have almost felt and I don't know if anybody else in my position who's, you know, wanting to advocate for the rights of people living with HIV have felt the same. But sometimes I almost think, you know, am I like a bit of a broken record here? I feel guilty because, you know, we advanced so much within the UK, but then, you know, you stop and think and say, well, actually, you know what, the world is much bigger, and you know what we're trying to do here is create a movement that captures the entire world, and that ultimately one day everybody is on an equal footing and isn't discriminated against, not least because of the HIV status, but for anything else that in the past you know we've seen happen. So yeah, but I think Patrick summed it up perfectly in terms of what we tried to do in this case to start that movement.
Now we've nearly come to the end, and we did have one other question submitted, but I needed to leave it to the end because it brings a bit of brevity to the conversation. It was to you, James. What is the strangest thing that someone has asked you since you've become a minor celebrity?
Okay. Z list of the Z list. Wow. I'm just racking my brains to think if my mother and father are watching this live just now. No. I think there's been the weirdest thing has just been so many sort of proposals, for want of a better word, from sort of far corners of the world that I never imagined. So, you know, in a world that isn't locked down, I could there's definitely a home waiting for me in Colombia and the Philippines and California. So yeah, that was very flattering and unnerving in equal measure.
One day you'll be able to go fly and meet them.
Yeah, the beauty of social media. Well, it just leaves me to say thank you both for having this conversation with us. It's been really interesting conversation. I'm sure it's been interesting for people watching. We've had a message from your mum who is watching. So hello, Karen. But I'm sure they're as equally proud of you as we are for all that you've done over the past couple of years, and not only making that change, but helping to challenge some of the stigma that you have done when you became that minor celebrity, to get all those proposals from far-flung places. We are hopefully going to be back next week with another Q&A, but we might also be taking a break, so watch our social media channels. But I'll just finish up by saying thanks to James, thanks to Patrick. And
Wait, I have one last thing to say, and that is that, you know, we also should acknowledge the work that HIV Scotland has done here, because you are a small charity that punches way above its weight, and as a nimble, smart organization, you take on big causes, big organizations, you have political clout, you have incredible contacts, and you know how to campaign, you know how to get things done. And actually, I can't think of another organization who would have handled this better and had better results.
Thank you very much for that.
100% agree. And just to add to that one, Nathan, just before we go, this is the first time that the three of us have had an opportunity to sort of be in the same room, so to speak, publicly. It's no exaggeration for me to say that without the support of both you and of Patrick, none of this would have happened for me. So thank you.
I can't remember that night in the Japanese restaurant when we were celebrating.
Yes, no one can remember that.
Well, I think we'll leave it on there. Thanks to James, to Patrick, and everyone that has been watching. We'll pick this conversation up again, I'm sure, soon. But for now, good night.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.